I was sitting in my new cardiologist's office for a routine checkup when a framed photo on his mahogany desk made my blood run cold. It was my wife. She was wearing the exact custom red silk dress I'd bought her in Milan just 3 months ago. When the doctor walked in, radiating pure confidence, I pointed to the photo and casually asked who the beautiful woman was. His face lit up with absolute devotion. He told me she was his fiancée, Cindy, who was unfortunately trapped in a nightmare marriage to a dying billionaire. He smiled and said they were just waiting for her husband's heart to finally give out. In that moment, my heart didn't stop. It turned to ice. Before I tell you how I dismantled their perfect little plan, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you believe that betrayal must be met with calculated justice, like and subscribe. My name is Victor Harrison. I'm 70 years old, and over the last 4 decades, I've built an $80 million logistics and real estate empire right here in Chicago. I didn't inherit a dime. I built it through sheer willpower, endless nights, and an instinct for reading people that has never failed me. At my age, you learn to see the world for what it really is when all the pretty illusions are stripped away. You learn to recognize the greedy look in a competitor's eyes, and you learn to smell a bad deal from a mile off. But a man never expects to negotiate for his life inside his own home. Or in this case, inside the spotless, lifeless office of a highly respected medical professional. My wife, Cynthia, had booked the appointment for me. She's 52, stunning, elegant, and has been my second wife for the past 20 years. Recently, I'd been experiencing minor heart flutter. Nothing unusual for a man my age running a massive enterprise, but enough to warrant attention. Cynthia was unusually persistent. She researched the best specialists in the city, her devotion and concern for my health warming my aging heart. She landed on Dr. Miles Preston. He was 48 at the top of his game and enjoyed a reputation as a miracle worker among Chicago's elite. My executive assistant made the booking under my initials, V. Harrison, a standard security protocol to avoid unwanted attention. The office was everything you'd expect from a high-end doctor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the magnificent Mile, sleek leather chairs, and a massive mahogany desk free of any medical clutter. I was sitting in one of those leather chairs, waiting for the doctor to review my chart, when my eyes drifted to a silver frame angled slightly toward his chair. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I leaned forward and squinted slightly. The woman in the photo was laughing, her head tilted back in a moment of pure, unscripted joy. Her blonde hair spilled perfectly over her bare shoulders. But what truly stopped my breath was the dress. It was a striking, fiery red silk dress with a distinct asymmetric neckline. You don't forget a dress like that, especially when you personally spent $15,000 on a master tailor in Milan just 3 months ago to custom make it to your wife's exact measurements. I still remembered zipping up that dress in our hotel suite, kissing her neck, and telling her she was the most beautiful woman in all of Italy. Yet here she was, frozen in a silver frame, sitting proudly on the desk of a man I had never met. My mind raced, trying to process the disconnect. Could it be a coincidence? A stock photo. But the small scar just above her left collarbone was clearly visible. A childhood injury she'd told me about on our 3rd date. It was Cynthia. Before shock could turn into a physical reaction, the heavy oak door swung open. Dr. Miles Preston walked in. He wore a tailored suit under a spotless lab coat, exuding the kind of arrogance and confidence that only an unchecked life of privilege can breed. He extended a manicured hand with a bright, expensive smile. Mr. Harrison, pleasure to finally meet you. Apologies for the wait. I was just reviewing your preliminary test results. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, but my focus was entirely on controlling my internal temperature. In business, when you discover a competitor's fatal weakness, you don't gasp, you don't flip the table, you smile, and you let them keep talking. No problem at all, doctor, I replied, keeping my voice steady and measured. I gestured casually toward the silver frame on his desk. I was just admiring the photo. She's a lovely woman. Is she your fiancée? Miles let out a soft chuckle filled with tenderness, sending a fresh wave of ice through my veins. He walked behind his desk, looking down at the photo with absolute devotion. Actually, yes, his voice softened. Her name is Cindy, the absolute love of my life. Cindy. Cynthia. She hadn't even bothered to deviate far from her real name. Congratulations, I leaned back comfortably, playing the part of a chatty, harmless old gentleman. You must be very happy. When is the big day? Miles sighed, adjusting the stethoscope around his neck. A shadow of frustration crossed his perfectly tanned face. Well, it's a bit complicated at the moment. We're still waiting. Cindy is currently trapped in a nightmare of a marriage. Oh? I raised an eyebrow, feigning mild, polite curiosity. That's a shame. Why doesn't she just leave? Miles leaned against his desk, arms crossed. He seemed eager to boast, desperate, to share this tragic romantic story with a stranger he assumed was just another anonymous patient. Her husband is a controlling, elderly billionaire. Extremely possessive. If she tries to divorce him, he'll drag her through the courts for years and leave her with nothing. Between you and me, he leaned in, slightly, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial tone. His heart is failing. He doesn't have much time left. We're just waiting for nature to take its course. Once that happens, she's finally free. The room seemed to shrink. The silence lasted only a fraction of a second. But in my mind, it felt like an eternity. A controlling elderly billionaire. A failing heart. They were just waiting for nature to take its course. He had no idea who I was. Cynthia had used her maiden name, Cindy Thorne, and completely hidden my true identity from him. To Dr. Miles Preston, I was just V. Harrison, an elderly man complaining of minor heart issues. He had no idea that the elderly billionaire, whose passing he was waiting for, was sitting less than 3 feet away, looking him dead in the eye. Well? I said softly, stripping every trace of anger from my voice. I suppose patience is a virtue. I hope things work out exactly as you plan for you and Cindy. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I appreciate that. He smiled, entirely oblivious to the predator sitting across from him. He picked up a sleek pen and turned his attention back to my chart. Now, let's talk about your condition. Your results show some minor irregularities. Nothing we can't manage, but given your age, we need to take a proactive approach. He pulled open a drawer, brought out a small, amber prescription bottle, and slid it across the smooth wooden desk toward me. I'm putting you on a new medication, Miles continued, returning to his professional medical persona. It's highly effective at regulating irregularities like yours. I want you to take one every morning. It should stabilize your system and prevent any sudden physical strain. I picked up the amber bottle. It felt heavy in my hand. I looked at the label neatly printed with my name. Then I looked back at the photo of my wife in the red silk dress from Milan. This wasn't just a prescription. It was a trap. Cynthia hadn't just found me a doctor to manage my health. She had found a doctor who was highly motivated to see my heart give out. A collaborator who could administer a dangerous cocktail under the guise of legitimate medical care. A man who could sign off on my passing without raising a single red flag. One every morning, I repeated slowly, tightening my grip on the bottle. Exactly, Miles gave a reassuring nod. You might feel some fatigue during the first few days as your body adjusts, but trust me, it's exactly what you need. I place my complete trust in you, doctor, I said as I stood up, sliding the bottle into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I will follow your instructions precisely. Wonderful. We'll schedule a follow-up in a month to see how you're progressing. I look forward to it, I replied. I turned and walked out of the office, posture upright, footsteps firm. I didn't run. I didn't confront him on the spot. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the steel doors closed, sealing me in quiet descent, the civilized, loving husband of 20 years quietly ceased to exist. In his place stood the man who had ruthlessly conquered the Chicago real estate market. My enemies were no longer sitting in boardroom meetings. They were sleeping in my bed, holding my prescriptions. They thought they were dealing with a clueless, frail old man. They had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. On the drive back to the penthouse, overlooking Lake Michigan, I used those 30 minutes to lock the burning fury inside me into a cage. My entire life had been built on assessing risk, neutralizing threats, and acquiring assets. My home was supposed to be my sanctuary, but I was walking right back into a viper's nest. When the private elevator doors opened directly into our foyer, the scent of expensive lilies and Cynthia's signature perfume greeted me. She was standing by the living room's floor-to-ceiling windows, arranging a bouquet of flowers. Wearing a crisp white shirt and cashmere trousers, she was the picture of a loyal, elegant wife. I walked toward her, leaning slightly on my wooden cane to maintain the illusion of the fragile old man she and her doctor were so eager to see. "Victor, darling," she said sweetly, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. Her lips felt like ice against my skin. "How did the appointment with Dr. Preston go?" "I've been worried sick all morning." I offered a weary but grateful smile, gently patting her hand. "He was exceptional, Cynthia. Very thorough," I said. "He mentioned my heart requires careful management, but he prescribed a new medication that should resolve these minor issues." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the amber bottle, and placed it on the marble kitchen island. He seemed very confident in this treatment. Cynthia's eyes immediately darted to the bottle. It was a micro-expression, a faint glint of triumph that lasted a split second, but I caught it. I had spent 40 years reading the subtle cues of ruthless executives across negotiation tables. That look was greed. Pure, unadulterated greed. "Oh, thank goodness," she sighed, placing a comforting hand on my chest, directly over the heart she was plotting to stop. "I just want you to be healthy and stay by my side for a long time." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and decided to test the waters. "You know, seeing the doctor today reminded me of our trip to Milan. We walked so much that day. Do you remember that custom red silk dress I bought you? The one with the asymmetric neckline? I haven't seen you wear it in months. You should put it on for dinner tonight to celebrate my health." Cynthia didn't miss a beat. Her heart rate didn't spike, her breathing remained steady. She simply smiled, her lips curving into a gentle, almost apologetic arch. "Oh, darling, I donated that to a charity auction last month," she lied smoothly, pouring me a glass of sparkling water. Don't you remember? It was a bit too flashy for my current taste, and the auction raised so much money for the children's hospital. I thought you'd be proud of me. It was a masterclass in deception. Flawless, plausible, delivered with just the right touch of selfless charm to make me feel guilty for even asking. Had I not seen that exact dress draped over her shoulders in a silver frame on her lover's desk just an hour ago, I would have believed her entirely. I took the glass from her, marveling at the monster I had married. Of course, I took a slow sip. "You're always so generous." "Always," she whispered, handing me the amber bottle. "So, did the doctor say you should take this right away? We shouldn't delay your treatment." "He said one every morning," I replied, "but he suggested I start immediately." I opened the bottle. Inside were nondescript white capsules. I knew I had to take this first one. If I hesitated or refused, her suspicion would be aroused. A cornered rat is far more dangerous than a comfortable one. I needed her to believe she was winning. I placed the capsule on my tongue, raised the glass, and swallowed it right in front of her. Her smile widened, the corners of her eyes crinkling with genuine relief. She kissed my cheek again. "Perfect. Go rest in the study, darling. I'll have the chef prepare a light, heart-healthy lunch for you." I nodded, shuffling slowly toward my private study. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the facade dropped. I sat heavily in my leather chair, staring out at the Chicago skyline. I needed a plan. I needed to isolate my assets, contact my legal team, and prepare a counterstrike that would ruin them both entirely. But before I could even log into my secure laptop, the physical toll of that single white capsule hit me like a freight train. It started as a dull ache right behind my sternum. Within 20 minutes, that ache exploded into a sharp, suffocating pressure. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision blurring into a disorienting gray. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, soaking my collar. This wasn't a placebo, and it wasn't a mild side effect. The doctor had given me a dangerous chemical cocktail designed to push an already strained cardiovascular system off a cliff. My left arm went completely numb, a heavy, cold deadness radiating from my shoulder down to my fingertips. My breathing turned shallow and rapid, every breath feeling like inhaling crushed glass. I tried to stand up to reach the hidden intercom beneath the desk, the one linked directly to my private security team. But my legs gave out. I collapsed back into the chair, clutching my chest. A raw, primal panic surged through me. Was this how it ended? Was I going to perish right here in my study, surrounded by my wealth, brought down on day one by a single capsule? I forced myself to breathe, slowly, rhythmically. I refused to let Cynthia win this easily. I refused to give Dr. Miles Preston the satisfaction of signing my death certificate today. I dragged myself toward the bottom drawer of my desk, my fingers fumbling awkwardly with the biometric lock. Inside was a concealed compartment containing emergency medical supplies, including a potent vasodilator prescribed by my previous legitimate physician for severe angina. With trembling, unresponsive fingers, I managed to break open the small vial. I placed the emergency tablet under my tongue and slumped onto the floor, praying it would counteract whatever toxic substance Preston had prescribed. For 10 agonizing minutes, I lay on the Persian rug, staring at the ornate ceiling, fighting a silent, desperate battle for survival. Slowly, the overwhelming weight on my chest began to lift. The numbness in my arm faded to a dull tingling, and my vision cleared. The emergency medicine had worked. I pulled myself up, exhausted and drenched in sweat, but alive. I walked into the adjoining private bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection. I looked old, frail, and entirely like a man on the verge of a massive cardiac event. The design of that capsule was to precisely mimic natural heart failure. If I had succumbed, standard toxicology would never pick it up. It would just be seen as the inevitable, tragic end of an elderly billionaire. Cynthia would shed her beautifully rehearsed tears at my funeral, wearing designer black silk instead of red. She would inherit my $80 million empire and waste it alongside the man who wrote the prescription. I dried my face with a towel. The physical pain in my chest was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They had made their move. They had smuggled poison into my home and watched me swallow it. They thought the game was already over. I walked back to the desk and picked up the amber bottle. I poured the remaining white capsules onto the mahogany surface. I needed an independent toxicology report to prove what these actually were, but I couldn't take another one. Opening a drawer, I found an old bottle of standard vitamin supplements. The capsules were identical in shape, size, and color to Preston's prescription. Carefully and methodically, I poured the dangerous pills into a secure plastic evidence bag, then refilled the amber bottle with the harmless vitamins. I would take a vitamin every morning. I would let Cynthia watch me swallow them. I would let her count the decreasing pills in the bottle, convincing her that with each passing day, my end was drawing closer. I needed her to feel absolute certainty in her impending victory. Because, while she waited for my heart to give out, I was going to systematically and thoroughly dismantle her entire world. I reached for my secure phone and dialed my private attorney, ready to set the trap. The next morning arrived, with a suffocating, heavy silence. Even though I had swapped the dangerous capsules for harmless vitamins, the shadow of that first pill lingered. My muscles felt heavy as lead. This was a literal battle for survival. I had to maintain the illusion that my health was rapidly deteriorating. If I appeared energetic, Cynthia would suspect something was wrong. She would contact her lover, and they would adjust their strategy. I couldn't afford to let them change the board before I set my own pieces in place. Reaching for my wooden cane, I practiced letting my hands shake with a subtle, deliberate tremor. I let my shoulders slouch, mimicking a man whose body was failing him. The hardest part was sharing my home with a woman who wanted me in a casket. It was a brutal, psychological strain. In the kitchen, the aroma of espresso filled the air. Cynthia was pouring coffee into my favorite mug. Dressed in a soft silk robe, she looked every bit the devoted wife she had pretended to be for 20 years. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She walked over and kissed my cheek. "You look so exhausted today. Did you sleep well?" I let out a strained sigh, leaning heavily against the counter. "It was a rough night," I said, keeping my voice thin and raspy. "My chest feels extremely tight." Cynthia's eyes widened with flawless concern. She placed a comforting hand on my arm. "Oh, Victor, that breaks my heart. But Dr. Preston said the medication might cause some fatigue at first. We have to trust the process. Did you take your pill today?" I gave a weak nod. "I was just about to." She picked up the amber bottle, unscrewed the cap, and poured a white capsule into her manicured hand, handing it to me along with a glass of water. I took the pill and the glass. Placing the capsule on my tongue, I took a sip and swallowed. It was just a simple, harmless vitamin. But she didn't know that crucial detail. Her eyes locked onto my throat, watching the swallow with predator-like focus. It was the look of a hunter watching a trap snap shut. "There now," she said softly, taking the empty glass from my trembling hand. "You'll feel better, soon. I promise." I thanked her and slowly shuffled back toward my study. Once the door was locked behind me, I dropped the act. Standing straight, the tremors vanished from my hands. I opened the hidden compartment in my desk and placed a true, dangerous pill into a secure bag. I decided to keep the actual toxins hidden in my palm whenever possible, just in case she attempted to feed them to me herself. Over the next few days, our routine became a chilling theatrical performance. I would stumble into the kitchen, looking increasingly frail. She would offer fake sympathy and hand me a vitamin. I would swallow it, and she would smile. However, the true depths of her dark intentions weren't fully exposed until the fourth night. I was lying in bed, the room cloaked in shadows. I had trained myself to sleep lightly, listening for her footsteps at all times. Around 2 in the morning, the heavy bedroom door creaked open. Closing my eyes, I adjusted my breathing to the slow, heavy rhythm of a man sedated by a failing body. I heard the soft rustle of her silk robe as she crossed the carpet. She walked straight to my nightstand, where the amber bottle sat in the dim glow of the city lights. I opened my eyes just a fraction, peering through my eyelashes. Cynthia stood beside me. The faint ambient light illuminated her face, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. There was no affection in her expression, no pity, not even a shred of guilt. Her face was a cold, calculating, intensely impatient mask. She reached out a steady hand and picked up the amber bottle. The plastic gave a faint click as she unscrewed the cap. Pouring the contents into her palm, she used her slender fingers to count the remaining white capsules. 1, 2, 3, 4. She was taking a silent inventory of my impending end, verifying that the pilking at the expected rate to ensure I was steadily marching toward the grave she and her lover had dug for me. She poured the pills back into the container, twisted the cap tight, and placed the bottle back on the smooth wood, precisely where she had found it. Then she leaned down, her face hovering inches from mine. I could smell the expensive night cream on her skin, feel the faint warmth of her breath against my cheek. I kept my breathing steady, muscles relaxed, suppressing every raw instinct screaming at me to reach out and snap her treacherous neck. "Not much longer, you stubborn old fool," she whispered softly, her voice devoid of human warmth. "Just let go. Stop fighting it. Miles promised me it would be quick. You owe me this. You owe me everything." She stood up, turned around, and quietly slipped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The heavy silence returned to the bedroom, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I lay motionless in the dark, staring at the vaulted ceiling, my mind burning with a terrible, absolute clarity. Until that exact moment, a foolish part of me had harbored a sliver of doubt. A tiny voice had whispered that maybe I misunderstood the photograph, that maybe the reaction to the first pill was just a tragic medical error or a terrible coincidence. I wanted to believe that the woman who had shared my bed for 20 years was incapable of deliberate harm. But that tiny, hopeful whisper was now completely dead. Cynthia had destroyed it with her own hands. She had stood over my vulnerable frame, actively wishing for my heart to stop. She was a predator waiting for her prey to bleed out. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, wiping away any lingering trace of the husband I used to be. I was no longer a man trying to fix a failing marriage. I was trapped in an active crime scene, sharing oxygen with my executioner. I sat up slowly in the cold dark, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed. The sense of weakness vanished, replaced by a surge of focused adrenaline. If she wanted a ghost, I would give her one. I was going to become an invisible, lethal force inside this penthouse. Reaching for my heavy wooden cane, I gripped it tightly in my fist, not for physical support, but like a weapon. My instincts had sharpened into an absolute, unshakable resolve. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to gather the ammunition needed to completely tear down her world of betrayal. The morning sun cut through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows. I stayed in bed, listening to Cynthia prepare for her day. When she walked in, I deepened my breathing and let my shoulders slump into the plush pillows. I told her I was far too exhausted to go to the office, explaining that my chest felt extremely tight and I needed to rest. A flash of that same predator-like excitement flickered in her eyes. She leaned down smoothly, pressing a practiced kiss onto my forehead, whispering that she would cancel her lunch plans to stay by my side. But I firmly insisted she go. I played the role of the dying husband to perfection. With convincing reluctance, she agreed, promising to return early in the afternoon. The moment the front door clicked shut, I threw off the heavy duvet. Locking my private study door, I dialed my assistant, instructing her to clear my entire schedule for the next 3 days, citing a mild illness. I made sure my voice sounded weak. Rumors of my deteriorating health needed to reach their ears, fueling their false sense of absolute security. I retrieved the plastic evidence bag, containing the dangerous pills from my desk's hidden compartment. Tucking it into my jacket pocket, I grabbed the keys to a nondescript gray sedan and slipped out quietly via the service elevator. I needed answers, but I couldn't use any medical facilities within Chicago. My name carried too much weight. A billionaire secretly testing his medication for toxins would trigger a media frenzy and immediately alert Cynthia. I drove south, leaving the towering city of glass and steel behind, heading toward an independent toxicology lab just across the Indiana border, a place known for prioritizing absolute discretion and privacy. The 90-minute drive gave me plenty of time to reflect on the sheer absurdity of my situation. I wasn't born into boardrooms. I wasn't born to 45 years ago, my entire empire consisted of a single rusted delivery truck with a failing transmission. I drove that truck relentlessly through harsh Chicago winters, hauling heavy cargo for 16 exhausting hours a day, sleeping in the freezing cab. In the 1980s, when local extortionists attempted to shake me down, I didn't back down. I negotiated my way out through sheer defiance. In the 90s, when corporate raiders tried to bleed my growing business dry, I dismantled every single one of them. I learned long ago that the world respects only absolute strength, meticulous preparation, and a complete refusal to surrender. I built my empire by being tougher, smarter, and far more relentless than those who wanted to see me fail. Now, my greatest threat wasn't a ruthless cartel boss. It was a cowardly doctor wielding a prescription pad and a treacherous woman I had showered with expensive diamonds. I had survived the worst of the corporate world. I refused to be brought down by amateur opportunists. I pulled into the quiet industrial park in Indiana. The private lab operated out of a modest brick building with heavily tinted windows. Walking inside with quiet confidence, I presented myself to the professional at the front desk using an alias. I paid a substantial expedited fee in untraceable cash, demanding that the chief toxicologist immediately analyze the chemical composition of the mysterious capsules. I took a seat in the sterile waiting area. The agonizing wait felt like an eternity. Sitting on a rigid plastic chair, sipping stale coffee, every slow minute stretched endlessly. I kept my mind focused on the complex logistics of my upcoming counterstrike, treating this domestic betrayal strictly as a hostile corporate takeover. After 3 tense hours, the double doors opened. The chief toxicologist, an older man, with tired eyes and a stained lab coat, walked toward me holding a thick manila folder. He invited me into his private office, his expression deadpan and unreadable. He sat heavily behind a cluttered desk, deliberately opening the confidential file. He looked up and asked directly where I had managed to acquire these specific capsules. I firmly told him it was a strictly private matter of extreme confidentiality. He gave a slow nod, respecting the boundary entirely. He informed me calmly that whoever had maliciously counted these specific pills possessed a highly sophisticated, lethal understanding of cardiovascular pharmacology. These were absolutely not traditional heart medications. They were not designed to gently regulate a mild arrhythmia. Toxicologist pointed directly to the complex chemical breakdown report, printed in bold black ink on the bright white page. He explained in thorough detail that the capsules contained a heavily concentrated, dangerously synthetic compound. It was specifically engineered to act as a silent, completely invisible internal accelerator. Once ingested, this toxic formulation would slowly bind to sensitive arterial walls, causing a progressive, severe spike in blood pressure. It was designed with malice to force a struggling heart to overwork at an exponential rate while constricting key blood vessels. He looked me dead in the eye, delivering the terrifying medical truth. If an elderly man with a pre-existing heart condition unwittingly took these pills every day, his cardiovascular system would suffer catastrophic physical strain. Within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, the cumulative internal effect would induce a massive, fatal cardiac event. A sudden failure of that magnitude would be nearly impossible to survive. But the most chilling detail was its underlying chemical nature. The lethal compound was synthesized to metabolize and break down completely within a few hours of a fatal event. It would leave zero detectable chemical residue in the human bloodstream or surrounding organ tissue. If I had passed away, a standard post-mortem medical examination would have shown nothing untoward. The assigned coroner would easily conclude that I had simply succumbed to natural, age-related heart failure. It was the ultimate undetectable weapon. I sat rigid in the leather chair, quietly absorbing the clinical, cold confirmation of the death sentence intended for me. Cynthia and Miles were not merely hoping I would pass away. They had engineered a flawless, undetectable assassination. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. 2 to 3 weeks. If I had swallowed that first pill unknowingly yesterday, I realized, and continued the course, I would be completely gone before the month was out. I thanked the scientist, took the official laboratory report, and walked directly back to my waiting car. The midday sun felt strangely cold against my skin. I tossed the thick manila folder onto the empty passenger seat. The lingering suspicion was gone. I now held undeniable, concrete, scientific proof of their plot. I was officially a marked man, but they had made a fundamental miscalculation on the exact timeline. They arrogantly assumed I was a fragile, clueless victim waiting quietly for a bitter end. They didn't realize I was about to weaponize their entire scheme against them. I started the engine and gripped the steering wheel, a cold, deliberate anger taking over my mind. The defensive phase of this quiet war was officially over. It was time to set the trap. On the third night of this surveillance operation, I finally locked myself in my private study under the pretense of severe fatigue. The thick oak door sealed me in comfortable silence, far away from the watchful eyes of my treacherous wife. I sat at my large custom wooden desk and opened my heavily encrypted laptop. The biometric scanner flashed red, verified my fingerprint, and granted me unrestricted access to the digital panopticon my security team had installed throughout the penthouse. I took a slow breath, preparing myself for the painful reality I was about to consume. I navigated the cursor to a hidden audio file recorded earlier that afternoon in the spacious main living room. I fully expected to hear Cynthia whispering on a private call to Dr. Miles Preston. I anticipated hearing her describe my fake physical struggles, perhaps complaining about how stubbornly I was holding on to life. I slipped the noise-canceling headphones over my ears and stared at the moving digital audio waves on the high-resolution screen. The crisp recording began with the subtle background sounds of the penthouse. I heard the distant hum of city traffic through the soundproof glass windows and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock standing in the marble hallway. Then, the heavy front door opened abruptly, shutting with a sharp thud. Heavy, unusually hurried footsteps echoed across the polished foyer. This was not the confident, measured stride of an arrogant doctor. These frantic steps were driven by sheer panic. I heard Cynthia speak first. Her tone was sharp, stripped of the sweet, affectionate facade she used with me. She demanded to know why this uninvited guest had recklessly barged into the penthouse in the middle of the afternoon without calling first. The voice that answered made my blood run cold for the second time that week. It was Derek, my 30-year-old son, the chief operating officer of my logistics empire. The boy I had raised, educated, and groomed to inherit everything I spent 40 grueling years building from scratch. His voice was trembling, unnaturally high, carrying a pathetic, desperate edge. I could hear him pacing frantically on the hardwood floor. Ignoring Cynthia's hushed, angry reprimands, he let out a frantic burst of words. "How much longer, Cynthia?" Derek demanded, his words incoherent with fear. "The crypto guys are threatening to break my legs. You said the doctor's pills would work quickly." I sat motionless in my dark leather chair, my hands pressed flat against the desk, so hard my aging knuckles throbbed. My own son knew about the toxic pills. My own flesh and blood was relying on my painful, impending passing to cover up a massive, hidden financial hole. "Be patient," Cynthia replied with a chilling, sociopathic authority that sent a shiver down my spine. "If he passes too quickly, there will be an autopsy. We get the $80 million in a month. Keep your thugs at bay until then." The audio file continued ruthlessly, capturing the sickening, quiet argument between my wife and my son. But a sudden ringing in my ears drowned out the rest of their venomous words. I slowly removed the heavy headphones and set them on the desk. I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything across the room. I just stared at the blank wall, feeling a crushing weight descend onto my chest. This specific betrayal was 1,000 times worse than the revelation in the doctor's office. Cynthia was my second wife. We had spent 20 years together, but she was ultimately an outsider who had grown dangerously, murderously greedy. But Derek was my blood, my actual legacy. I held him in the delivery room the day he was born. I taught him how to ride a bike in the park. I watched proudly as he graduated with honors from a top business school, believing I had raised a strong, honorable man. I had handed him the operational keys to my kingdom, trusting him completely to lead the company into the next generation. Instead, he was nothing more than a weak, pathetic parasite. He was entirely willing to stand by and watch me suffocate in a fatal cardiac event just to clear his illegal underground debts. The sheer scale of this double betrayal threatened to overwhelm my mind. They were actively collaborating. The woman sleeping in my bed and the boy carrying my last name had formed an alliance against my life. They viewed my existence as a temporary inconvenience standing between them and my bank accounts. My deep grief over losing my only son lasted 10 painful, silent minutes. As I sat alone, in the dim light of my study, the morning vanished, replaced by a deep, cold, unforgiving rage. I quickly realized that Derek was not just a failure as a son. He had fundamentally betrayed the entire company I bled for over 4 decades. His unforgivable actions were a direct insult to everything I stood for. If he owed millions to violent criminals, he was a massive walking liability to the entire corporate structure. He wasn't just plotting a personal crime. He was actively endangering the livelihoods of thousands of hard-working, loyal employees who depended on my company to feed their families. I opened a secondary security portal on my laptop. Bypassing the standard corporate firewalls, I accessed the company's classified ledgers. I needed to see how much damage my son had secretly caused behind my back. I needed to trace every single stolen dollar he had touched. The emotional devastation was locked away in a psychological vault. They wanted to play a high-stakes game for $80 million. I was going to ensure that neither of them walked away with a single cent. I stared at the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop, the pale light casting sharp shadows across the mahogany desk. The grief of a betrayed father had been completely replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a veteran CEO preparing for war. Derek was a malignant growth spreading at the core of my life's work. I spent 40 hard years building an $80 million logistics empire from absolute nothing. I fought off corporate raiders and aggressive, hostile takeovers. Now, the most dangerous threat I had ever faced was sitting comfortably in my own penthouse, casually discussing an attempt on my life with my wife. This was no longer just a battle for physical survival. This was a war for my entire legacy. Derek had mentioned his violent cryptocurrency creditors on the recording. He was drowning in underground debt, desperately trying to buy time while waiting for the poison to stop my heart. But waiting wasn't his only financial strategy. If he was keeping those thugs at bay, he had to feed them substantial payouts. He didn't have the personal wealth for those sums. He was using my money. He was actively draining my company. My fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Bypassing standard executive security protocols, I accessed the buried corporate ledgers. As COO, Derek had high-level access, but he lacked the fundamental, root-level system access I had personally designed into the digital architecture decades ago. He arrogantly believed his digital footprint was invisible. He was wrong. I began a forensic digital audit of every corporate transactions processed over the last 8 months. I started by scanning the primary operating accounts for unexplained capital outflows. At first glance, was processed, were funded. At first glance, everything looked normal. Logistics contracts were funded, and quarterly earnings appeared stable, and quarterly earnings appeared, but I knew how desperate people operated when backed into a corner. They never stole from bright, visible primary accounts. They hid their dirty work deep in the shadows of secondary ledgers. I shifted my focus to our international logistics division, a massive subsidiary, handling hundreds of high-value shipments daily across multiple borders. The sheer volume of daily transactions made it the perfect chaotic place to hide systematic theft. I applied a specialized algorithmic filter, searching specifically for rapid recurring payments made to brand new, unknown vendor accounts. In less than 20 minutes, the ugly truth surfaced on the screen. I found the first anomaly deep within a routine quarterly expense report. A $400 Zuzozin unauthorized payment allocated to a mysterious consulting firm called Apex Global Solutions. I cross-referenced the vendor name against our approved corporate database. The company didn't exist. There were no legitimate records of their services, no official contacts, and no approval forms. It was a complete ghost. As I dug deeper into the digital web my son had woven, my heart pounded with a cold, rhythmic anger. Over 3 agonizing hours, I exposed a massive, fraudulent web of corporate contracts. Derek had secretly established 12 different shell companies. Over the past 6 months, he had been quietly siphoning corporate capital directly into these offshore accounts. He was drafting fake invoices for fictional supply chain optimization studies, non-existent digital security upgrades, and fabricated shipping tariffs. Utilizing his vast operational authority, he relentlessly signed off on these ghost contracts, bypassing financial review boards by keeping each individual payment just a few $1,000s below the threshold for a mandatory executive audit. It was a sophisticated, carefully orchestrated embezzlement operation. He had already stolen nearly $4 million of my hard-earned money. But $4 million was clearly not enough to satisfy the dangerous creditors he had entangled himself with. He had squandered millions on volatile cryptocurrency investments that crashed, leaving him exposed to ruthless thugs who cared nothing for corporate titles. They only cared about getting paid immediately. These ghost contracts were a temporary delay tactic. He was draining just enough corporate blood to keep the wolves from his door, while impatiently waiting for my heart to fail. I leaned back in my chair, the bright monitor reflecting in my eyes. The sheer scale of his betrayal was astonishing. He was destroying a thriving company that employed thousands of innocent people. He was willing to burn my logistics empire to the ground, just to save his own neck. He truly believed he could step in, inherit the remaining $80 million, cover his illegal tracks, and walk away as a wealthy man. I meticulously downloaded every fraudulent contract, fake invoice, and wire transfer log onto a heavily encrypted external drive. I was gathering absolute evidence to ruin him in court. However, simply sending my only son to a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud was no longer enough. That was too quick, too easy. He had conspired with my wife to end my life. He had cheered for my passing. I needed his destruction to be absolute. I needed to set him up, letting him believe his plan was working flawlessly. I had to keep playing the frail, dying old man coughing in the living room while I secretly dismantled his entire existence from behind the study door. Re-entering the security system, I placed advanced, invisible tracking algorithms on all his fraudulent shell accounts. The next time he tried to transfer even a single dollar of stolen funds to his creditors, I would know instantly. The digital clock on my laptop read 4 a.m. The penthouse was dead silent, but my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I closed the laptop and placed the encrypted drive into a hidden safe. Standing up, I gripped my wooden cane, ready to step back onto the stage. The sun would rise soon, and I needed to be ready to greet my wife and son with a weak, dying smile. Morning light cast a cold, harsh glare across the penthouse. I stepped out of the bedroom, leaning on my wooden cane, my hands shaking with practiced precision. Cynthia was in the kitchen sipping espresso, while Derek sat casually at the island eating toast, acting as though he wasn't conspiring against my life. I offered them a fragile smile. Derek looked at me with fake concern, asking how I felt. In a raspy voice, I told him my chest felt like a cage of pain, and that I urgently needed to get my affairs in order. Retreating to the living room, I called Mitchell Crawford, my powerhouse attorney, a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who had guarded my corporate empire for 2 decades. I told him to clear his schedule and come directly to the penthouse, emphasizing that it was a matter of life and death. I asked him to bring his encrypted laptop and a portable printer. While waiting, I checked the hidden audio transmitters installed by my security team. One sat directly above the seating area in my study, perfectly positioned to capture every word spoken. I needed Cynthia and Derek to hear exactly what I was about to do. I needed them to believe their timeline was aligning with my growing paranoid fears. An hour later, Mitchell arrived carrying his heavy leather briefcase. His sharp eyes scanned my frail posture and the wool blanket draped over my legs. He followed me into the study, closing the heavy oak door behind us. I didn't bother turning on the white noise generator I normally used for confidential legal discussions. I wanted this entire conversation broadcast loud and clear. Sinking into the leather chair, I let out a long, broken sigh. "Mitchell," I said, deliberately making my voice sound heavy with fear. "My heart is failing. The doctors aren't optimistic. I can feel my body giving out with every beat. I need to draft a new will immediately. Right here, right now." Mitchell frowned, pulling a legal pad from his briefcase. He reminded me that we had updated my estate plan just 6 months ago, establishing a complex trust that heavily restricted Derek's access to funds and explicitly outlined a pending divorce settlement for Cynthia. "Burn that old document," I ordered, raising my voice to ensure the hidden microphones picked up my desperation. "I don't have time for trusts or restrictions. I want them taken care of immediately. Draft a new document. I want 100% of my assets, all voting rights in the company, the logistics empire, offshore accounts, and the entire real estate portfolio split straight down the middle. Exactly 50% to my wife, Cynthia, and 50% to my son, Derek." Mitchell stared at me as if I had lost my mind. Leaning across the desk, he lowered his voice, asking if I was absolutely certain. He reminded me of Derek's reckless financial history and Cynthia's suspicious loyalty. He urged me to reconsider in order to protect vital corporate voting rights and ensure the company survived my passing. I slammed my fist onto the desk in a burst of staged anger, playing the panicked, dying man to perfection. "Don't argue with me, Mitchell," I shouted, my voice breaking on cue. "I'm dying. They're my only family, the only ones taking care of me in my final days. I want them to have complete, unrestricted control the second my heart stops. Print the draft now." Mitchell shook his head, clearly thrown off by my sudden emotional state. But as my attorney, he complied with my direct order. Opening his laptop, he connected the small portable printer and began typing rapidly. For 20 minutes, the only sounds in the private study were the rapid clicking of his keyboard and my heavy, labored breathing. Finally, the printer whirred to life, filled with complex white paper, filled with complex legal jargon. These documents effectively handed my entire life's work over to the two greedy monsters who were desperate to see me gone. Mitchell placed the freshly printed documents directly on my desk. Pointing to the signature line, he handed me his heavy gold pen. "Leave it here," I whispered, slumping back into the chair and closing my eyes as if the argument had exhausted my failing heart. "I need to read through it carefully tonight to make sure the wording is airtight. Come back tomorrow morning, and I'll sign it in front of a notary." Mitchell reluctantly packed his equipment. He gave me a long zing, a great man convinced he was watching a great man succumb to the weakness of mortality. I thanked him and asked him to show himself out. The moment the study door clicked shut behind him, I sat up straight. The pathetic weakness vanished from my posture. Picking up the stack of documents, I placed them squarely in the center of my dark mahogany desk, ensuring the bold headline detailing the 50% asset split was clearly visible. It was the ultimate lure, perfectly set for two hungry predators. I walked quietly to my private bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out my encrypted security tablet. I pulled up the hidden camera network, pointing the lens directly at the study's heavy oak door. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 30 minutes after Mitchell left the penthouse, the study door creaked open. Cynthia slipped into the room, checking behind her to make sure the hallway was clear. Her movements were smooth and silent, like a seasoned thief. She glided straight toward my desk, her eyes locking onto the printed draft of the new will. I watched through the high-definition lens as she leaned over the document. Her manicured fingers traced the lines of text, hovering over her name and Derek's right next to the clause granting them unrestricted control over $80 million. That subtle, wicked sneer I had come to despise spread across her face, blooming into a genuine smile of absolute triumph. She quickly pulled a silver smartphone from her pocket, holding it steady over the desk to snap clear, high-resolution photos of every single page. She was undoubtedly sending those images directly to Derek and Dr. Miles, providing them with proof that their scheme had worked. They had successfully intimidated me into handing over control of my entire kingdom, just moments before my expected execution. I watched her slip out of the study, completely unaware that she had swallowed the bait whole. They thought they had finally won the war, believing the vast fortune was safely in their hands. Now, they would drop their guard completely. They would become arrogant, comfortable, and incredibly careless. And that was the exact moment I would strike, tearing away their false victory and burying them beneath the weight of their own overwhelming greed. I waited an hour in the main bathroom before returning to my private study. The heavy oak door remained shut tight, exactly as I had left it. Walking over to the mahogany desk, I looked down at the draft of the new will. To an untrained eye, it appeared completely untouched, but I had spent 40 years reading human behavior. I could practically feel the toxic residue Cynthia had left hovering over those fresh pages. She had taken the bait perfectly. Sitting down in the leather executive chair, I unlocked my secure laptop and pulled up the master console for the hidden surveillance network. I fully expected to intercept a celebratory conference call. I assumed she would immediately dial my treacherous son and her partner in crime, Dr. Miles, to boast about their impending financial victory. I slipped on the noise-canceling headphones, ready to listen, as they gleefully divided my $80 million empire. I located her live video feed. She was pacing inside her massive walk-in closet, surrounded by designer clothes, holding her silver smartphone to her ear. The ringing tone came through clearly via the hidden microphone embedded in the light fixture. On the second ring, a deep, professional male voice answered the call. It wasn't the familiar, arrogant tone of Dr. Miles Preston, nor was it the desperate, panicked voice of my son, Derek. "This is Gregory," the man stated calmly. I recognized the voice instantly. Gregory Harrison was a notoriously ruthless, aggressive attorney who specialized in hostile asset recovery and high-conflict divorces. He was a legal mercenary, a man who would ruin lives for a heavy retainer. "Gregory, it's Cynthia," she said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. The old fool just completely broke down. He had his attorney at the penthouse an hour ago. He rewrote the entire estate plan, leaving 50% of everything to me and the other 50% to Derek. He even included all corporate voting rights. Gregory let out a low, satisfied chuckle. "That's fantastic news, Cynthia. This new draft makes our next legal move much easier. How much time does his cardiovascular system have left?" 2 weeks, 3 at most, Cynthia replied coldly. "He looks awful. The synthetic compound is working just as Miles promised, but we need to finalize our second strategy. I refuse to share a single penny of that $80 million with a pathetic degenerate like Derek." I sat frozen in the study, my breath catching in my throat. I had assumed Cynthia and Derek were solid co-conspirators, bound by shared greed. I was wrong. I was listening to a deep, calculated betrayal. "We are in the perfect position to eliminate Derek," Gregory stated calmly. "Do you have the digital evidence regarding his recent offshore financial activities?" "I have everything," Cynthia hissed, a dark excitement in her voice. "I hired a private forensic accountant 3 months ago. I know the boy is drowning in underground debt. I let him panic. I watched him set up those 12 fake shell companies, and I let him forge Victor's signature on those ghost contracts. I have complete, undeniable proof that Derek embezzled nearly $4 million directly from the logistics empire." My mind reeled. Cynthia had known about the stolen company funds all along. She had actively allowed my company to bleed because it served her ultimate purpose. "That's perfect," Gregory replied. "Once Victor passes and the new will is finalized, I'll immediately trigger an anonymous federal audit of the logistics company. We'll hand the entire file over to federal authorities. Derek will instantly face charges of major corporate fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. He'll be looking at 20 years in federal prison. To land a plea deal, he'll be forced to relinquish his 50% share of the inheritance, returning it to the primary pool. You'll legally and cleanly absorb his entire portion." Cynthia let out a soft laugh, a chilling sound that echoed clearly through my headphones. "He's such a foolish, arrogant boy. He actually thought we were partners. He actually believed I would help him pay off those violent crypto thugs. Let him rot in a federal cell." I closed my eyes, absorbing the absolute shock of her deep, sociopathic ambition. But she wasn't finished. Her web of betrayal extended even further than my son. "And what about the good doctor?" Gregory asked, his tone shifting to a strictly analytical mode. "Miles Preston is a major liability. He knows the exact synthetic compound used to stop Victor's heart. He formulated the poison. For the next decade, he could easily blackmail you for millions. Do you have the leverage to neutralize him permanently?" Cynthia's voice hardened into absolute ice. "Miles is a lovesick, spineless fool. He thinks we're escaping to the French Riviera to spend the rest of our lives together. He has no idea what's waiting for him. Do you have physical evidence? Gregory pressed. I kept everything, she replied triumphantly. I kept the original handwritten prescription pads he used to authorize those toxic capsules. I kept the encrypted text messages detailing the chemical breakdown of the compound. I even have a secret recording where he admits the medication would artificially induce a fatal event without leaving any chemical trace in a standard autopsy. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white. She had meticulously documented the entire plot, creating a perfect paper trail that pointed straight to her own lover. As soon as Victor is buried, I'll immediately play the grieving, suspicious widow. Cynthia continued, her voice dripping with cruel excitement. I'll take those original prescription pads straight to the medical board and the district attorney. I'll claim I found them hidden in his office. I'll testify through tears that Dr. Miles Preston intentionally gave my husband the wrong medication. I'll sue him for gross medical malpractice and push the DA to charge him with first-degree manslaughter. He'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. He'll be completely ruined, Gregory noted, sounding genuinely impressed by her profound malice. Even if he tries to drag you down, no jury will believe a convicted, disgraced doctor over a weeping, traumatized widow exposing his fatal medical error. Precisely, Cynthia whispered. Derek goes to federal prison for corporate fraud. Miles goes to maximum security for medical manslaughter. And I walk away with 100% of the $80 million estate, corporate voting rights, and total freedom. The audio line gave a faint click, and the call disconnected. I sat in the dim study, staring at the screen. Slowly, I removed the heavy headphones. I was no longer just fighting two greedy opportunists. I was fighting a cold, brilliant monster. The Counterstrike starts now. Cynthia's darkness hung over me like a heavy shroud. I wasn't dealing with a simple, unfaithful wife. I was living with a calculating sociopath. She had used my son to commit massive corporate fraud just to lock him in a federal cage. She had seduced an arrogant cardiologist into formulating a lethal, untraceable poison just to hand him over to the DA the moment my heart stopped. She was going to destroy everyone in her path, and she was going to do it with a beautiful, tragic smile. Sitting in the dead silence of my private study, I realized a divorce or corporate firing wouldn't be enough. I needed to engineer a catastrophic collision that would shatter all her plans. I needed to trap all three of them in the same room and let the heavy doors of justice slam shut forever. The next morning, I contacted Mitchell Crawford. I told him to completely void the draft Will I had forced him to write. Instead, I instructed him to arrange an off-the-record meeting with the district attorney and the head of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Mitchell was bewildered by my miraculous recovery, but he did exactly what his fee demanded. We met deep inside a secure federal building in downtown Chicago, in a stark, windowless conference room. I didn't waste a second. I placed the independent toxicology report right in the center of the metal table. I explained how the synthetic compound was designed to induce a fatal cardiac event without leaving a trace. Next, I handed the federal agents the encrypted drive containing the evidence of my son's corporate embezzlement. The 12 fake shell companies, the ghost contracts, and the rapid offshore transfers. Finally, I played the high-definition audio recordings intercepted by my security team. I let the DA hear Derek begging for more time to pay off his crypto thugs followed by Cynthia detailing her master plan to her attorney. The silence in that federal room was deafening. The seasoned prosecutors were stunned by the sheer scale of the plot. Over 2 intense hours, we built an airtight legal strategy. The authorities would secure arrest warrants for attempted murder, corporate fraud, and medical malpractice. But I had one strict, non-negotiable condition. The final arrest had to take place on my terms, on my timeline, and inside my home. Late that afternoon, I returned to the penthouse, deliberately dragging my left leg and leaning heavily on my wooden cane. Cynthia met me in the foyer, her eyes searching my pale face for any sign that my end was near. I offered her a weak, exhausted smile. Taking her soft hand in my trembling ones, I told her my strength was fading faster than expected. In a raspy voice, I said my time was limited, but before I passed, I wanted one last memorable evening surrounded by the people I loved. I informed her I would be hosting a formal dinner party at the penthouse that weekend. It would serve as a joint celebration for our 20th anniversary and the occasion to officially announce my permanent retirement from the logistics empire. A flash of genuine shock crossed Cynthia's eyes. She tried to gently dissuade me, saying such an event would be too taxing on my heart, but I remained firm, playing the stubborn patriarch to perfection. I insisted the catering be flawless, the champagne vintage, and the guest list strictly limited to our inner circle. My first target was my son. The next morning, I summoned Derek to the penthouse living room. He stood near the windows, nervously shifting his weight, terrified that his creditors were closing in. Looking up at him from my armchair, I made my breathing sound shallow and labored. I told him his reckless behavior was forgiven, lying that I finally recognized his true business genius. I insisted he attend the upcoming dinner, strongly implying I would officially sign over absolute control of the $80 million enterprise to him in front of our guests. A wave of desperate relief washed over his pale face. He eagerly promised to attend, believing his financial salvation was finally within reach. The final piece of the trap required absolute finesse. While Cynthia was arranging flowers in the kitchen, I called Dr. Miles Preston on speakerphone. The cardiologist answered in his usual arrogant, smooth tone. Injecting a deep tremble into my voice, I told him the new medication was causing severe fatigue, but that I was deeply grateful for his unwavering care. I insisted he attend the formal dinner as my guest of honor, declaring I wanted to publicly toast the medical genius working tirelessly to manage my failing heart. Cynthia froze by the kitchen island. The heavy crystal vase in her hands trembled visibly. The last thing a calculating killer wants is all her targets and co-conspirators gathered in one bright room. She stepped forward, desperate to interject, and subtly encourage her lover to decline the invitation. But Dr. Miles Preston had an ego far too large to manage. He eagerly soaked up my extravagant praise, accepted the invitation smoothly, and promised to bring a fine bottle of wine to celebrate my ongoing treatment. I hung up and looked directly at my terrified wife. She stared back with wide, panicked eyes, unable to utter a coherent objection without exposing her guilt. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She was officially trapped in my net. She had spent months planning my silent murder. Now, I had backed her into a brightly lit room, right next to the son she intended to ruin, and the doctor she planned to put behind bars. The grand dining table was set for a feast, but they had no idea they were the ones on the menu. On the evening of our 20th anniversary, a severe storm brewed over the Chicago skyline. Heavy, Rain battered the penthouse windows, creating a rhythmic drumbeat that masked the suffocating tension building inside the dining room. The long mahogany table was set with fine crystal and polished silver, gleaming under the warm light of custom chandeliers. Chandeliers that were broadcasting every sound directly to a secure digital server monitored by federal agents. I stood in the marble foyer, waiting for my guests. I wore a tailored, dark gray suit. For the first time in 3 weeks, I wasn't using the heavy wooden cane. I had left it against the wall, a discarded prop from a play that was coming to an end. Cynthia stepped out of the master suite, wearing a stunning floor-length emerald gown and the diamond necklace I had bought her in Paris a decade ago. She looked every bit the radiant hostess, completely oblivious to the federal trap closing in around her. She froze when she saw me standing tall, without support. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed her face. I smiled warmly, offering my arm, and told her the excitement of the evening had given me a sudden surge of energy. Masking her unease with a stiff smile, she took my arm just as the private elevator chimed open. My son, Derek, was the first to step out. He looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. His tuxedo hung loosely on his thin frame. His face was pale, and his hands shook so violently he could barely hand his coat to the waiting attendant. I greeted him with a firm handshake, pulling him close and clapping him on the back. He flinched. I knew why he was terrified. His crypto creditors had undoubtedly given him a final ultimatum. He was desperately waiting for me to announce my retirement and hand over the assets, completely unaware that those assets were now frozen by the government. Moments later, Dr. Miles Preston arrived, striding into my home with sickening arrogance. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and carried a rare, expensive vintage Bordeaux. He presented the bottle to Cynthia with a lingering look that made my blood run cold. Turning to me, he adjusted his face into a mask of medical concern, asking softly how I was coping with the extreme fatigue caused by my new heart medication. I looked him dead in the eye, my posture straight, my voice ringing with undeniable strength. I told him I had never felt more energetic, more alert, or more focused in my entire life. Dr. Preston blinked, stunned by my booming tone. Recovering quickly, he suggested it was merely a temporary surge of adrenaline, strongly advising me not to overexert my fragile system. I let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the marble walls, then confidently led everyone into the grand dining room. I took my seat at the head of the table. Cynthia sat to my right, Derek to my left, and Dr. Preston directly across from me. We formed an intimate, lethal circle. The private chef served the first course, a rich lobster bisque. I ate with an uncharacteristic appetite, savoring every bite, while my 3 guests merely pushed the food around their porcelain plates. Derek kept his smartphone on the table right next to his water glass. The screen lit up every few minutes with new messages, and every bright flash made him flinch. I poured the vintage Bordeaux Dr. Preston had brought, ensuring everyone's glass was filled to the brim. Raising my own glass, I called for a toast to family, health, and the profound virtue of absolute loyalty. I took a deep sip, set the glass down, and locked my gaze on my sweating son. I casually mentioned how incredibly stressful the modern corporate world had become, speaking in a smooth, conversational tone about the dangerous pitfalls of reckless ambition. I talked about young executives who, getting involved with the wrong underground crowds, easily found themselves drowning in uncontrollable debt. Derek dropped his silver spoon. It slammed against his porcelain bowl with a loud clatter. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Stammering a weak response, he picked up his glass with trembling hands and took a heavy gulp to hide his terror. I shifted my gaze directly to Dr. Miles Preston. Smiling politely, I asked him about the heavy burden of medical responsibility. I wondered aloud how a highly educated, trusted physician could sleep at night, knowing he held the power of life and death in his hands. I casually explored the moral implications of a doctor knowingly violating his sacred oath to engage in toxic, destructive relationships. I used the word toxic deliberately, letting it hang heavy in the quiet air. Dr. Preston shifted uncomfortably, his arrogant smirk wavering. Clearing his throat, he offered a rehearsed cliché about always prioritizing the welfare of vulnerable patients. Cynthia tried desperately to intervene, steering the conversation toward our upcoming retirement plans. She aggressively tried to push the evening back to her script, asking nervously if I was still prepared to make my big announcement after the main course. I turned my head to look at the woman who had spent months plotting my murder, intending to frame her lover to steal my wealth. I told her I was absolutely ready to reveal everything tonight. I assured her the evening would involve a massive, unforgettable transfer of power that would permanently alter all our lives. The main course arrived, thick cuts of prime beef. I sliced my meat with aggressive precision, chewing slowly, soaking in the fear radiating from the three betrayers. I casually brought up a dark parable about wolves in sheep's clothing, waiting patiently for an old shepherd to fall asleep. The absolute problem with greedy wolves, I concluded, looking straight at Cynthia with a cold smile, is that once the fresh meat is gone, they inevitably turn on each other. The heavy silence that followed hung over the room like a suffocating fog. The absolute terror emanating from my guests had become a physical force, draining the air from their lungs. I let the agonizing silence stretch for a full minute while the private chef cleared the table and poured the last of the wine. When the heavy door clicked shut, isolating the four of us, I finally made my move. Reaching out a steady hand, I picked up my crystal glass. Taking a heavy silver spoon, I tapped the rim. The sharp, loud ring pierced the room like a gunshot. I set the glass down, pressing my hands flat against the polished wood. Then I stood up. I didn't struggle. I didn't gasp, groan, or reach for the wooden cane leaning uselessly in the far corner. I drew myself up to my full height, with the smooth, commanding strength of a man who had dominated the corporate world for 40 years. The frail, dying old man they had eagerly waited to bury vanished completely, replaced by a formidable reality. Derek immediately dropped his head, shrinking his shoulders as if expecting a physical blow. Cynthia stared up at me, her face frozen in panic. "Doctor." Miles Preston blinked repeatedly, his smirk melting into deep, unvarnished confusion. I looked down at them, my expression devoid of warmth. I began to speak, my voice echoing with a deep authority that demanded absolute focus. I told them that an anniversary was traditionally a time for reflection. A moment to look back on shared history, mutual sacrifice, and the trust that should hold a family together. I let my cold gaze sweep from my trembling son to my terrified wife. I continued, stating that retirement was similarly a moment of transition, the precise instance when a patriarch steps down, officially handing the keys to his kingdom to the next deserving generation. I paused, letting the weight of my words press heavily on them. Derek let out a weak whimper, his shaking hands gripping the edge of the table as if the floor were giving way beneath him. Reaching to the empty chair beside me, I picked up the thick manila folder I had hidden before dinner. I held the heavy document up to the light of the crystal chandelier, letting them clearly see the official federal seal stamped across the cover. Stepping away from the head of the table, I walked slowly around the edge, my footsteps echoing sharply on the polished marble. I stopped directly behind Dr. Miles Preston. The cardiologist went rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped his linen napkin. He tried to turn his head, but a paralyzing fear kept his gaze locked straight ahead. I raised the thick folder and, with a loud, violent slap, slammed it down into the center of his empty porcelain dessert plate. The heavy impact made all three of them jump. Leaning down, I placed my hands on the top of his chair, bringing my face right next to his sweating ear. "Dr. Preston," I whispered in a voice dripping with cold venom, "you are a brilliant cardiologist, but you are an absolute terrible killer." The doctor gasped, his entire body jerking as if he had touched a live wire. Whatever remained of his arrogant facade shattered into a million pieces. All color drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray. His chest heaved in rapid breaths as his eyes darted frantically around the room. He turned his head slowly, looking past me to lock a gaze of pure terror onto Cynthia. He was desperately seeking reassurance from the woman who had enticed him into the plot, hoping she would tell him this was a terrible misunderstanding or a cruel joke by a paranoid old man. But Cynthia couldn't help him. She was staring at the thick folder on his plate, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. She knew exactly what I had uncovered. Standing tall, I reclaimed the room. Pointing at the folder in front of the trembling cardiologist, I announced that the document contained the comprehensive results of an independent toxicology screening conducted 3 weeks ago in Indiana. I detailed how the report isolated the untraceable synthetic compound he had secretly formulated to artificially induce a fatal event. I watched absolute horror consume him, as I casually recite the exact chemical formula of his poison. The secret he had arrogantly believed would never be discovered. Miles Preston began to shake uncontrollably. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Stammering a broken denial, he claimed I was out of my mind, insisting he had merely prescribed standard heart medication to manage my condition. I let out a harsh, unforgiving laugh, telling him his lies were useless. Then I revealed that I possessed high-definition audio recordings of their secret phone calls where his beloved Cynthia had coldly outlined the murder plot to her attorney. I watched this realization hit the doctor with crushing force. I slowly explained that Cynthia had never intended to escape to the French Riviera with him. I told him she had deliberately saved his original handwritten prescription pads and the encrypted text messages detailing the poison. I announced her ultimate plan to the entire table. She was going to play the grieving widow the moment my heart stopped, handing every piece of evidence straight to the district attorney. She was prepared to sue him for gross medical malpractice and ensure he was convicted of first-degree manslaughter, simply to silence him forever. Dr. Miles Preston let out a choked, broken sob. The sheer scale of Cynthia's sociopathic betrayal had completely shattered him. He collapsed into his chair, burying his sweating face in his trembling hands. The arrogant cardiologist, who had glibly planned my passing, was now a pathetic, weeping wreck, fully realizing that his entire future had been obliterated by the woman he claimed to love. The grand dinner party had officially turned into a total execution. The trap had sprung, leaving no way out. I offered a cold smile, finally restoring justice to a room that had been filled with nothing but deceit. Before Cynthia could even open her mouth to construct a desperate defense, I reached over to the empty chair beside me and picked up the second thick manila folder. I walked slowly around the edge of the polished mahogany table, my footsteps echoing like the rhythmic ticking of a clock counting down to 0. I stopped directly behind my sweating, trembling son. With a heavy thud, I slammed the folder onto his porcelain plate, shattering the delicate crystal water glass beside it. Derek flinched hard, shielding his head with trembling arms, as if expecting the ceiling to collapse on his shoulders. "And then there's you, Derek," I said, my voice dropping into a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the room. $4 million in underground cryptocurrency debt. You've been actively embezzling massive amounts of capital from my company through 12 fake offshore shell companies, desperately trying to buy enough time for this doctor to stop my heart. Derek let out a choked gasp. He stared blankly at the detailed financial ledgers spilling across his plate, exposing every fraudulent wire transfer he had ever authorized. His face turned a sickly, translucent white. Looking up at me with tears streaming down his cheeks, he opened his mouth to beg for a forgiveness he didn't deserve. I immediately raised my hand, cutting off his whining with a commanding gesture. "Don't insult my intelligence by begging," I ordered coldly. "To pay off street thugs, you sold out your own father's life. You thought you were so clever, aligning with your manipulative stepmother behind my back so you could comfortably inherit my logistics empire. But you're nothing, just a naive, foolish pawn in a much darker game." I turned my focus back to the head of the table, directing my rage entirely at my wife. Cynthia was gripping the edge of the table, so hard, her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow and irregular. She knew the walls were closing in, but she had no idea just how absolute her destruction was about to be. Reaching into the inner pocket of my dark gray suit, I pulled out a small, highly advanced digital audio remote and pressed a silver button. A custom-installed surround sound system activated immediately. Suddenly, Cynthia's own voice filled the silent space, echoing off the marble walls with crystal-clear clarity. It was the confidential recording captured in her walk-in closet just 24 hours earlier. We listened together in excruciating silence. We heard her voice, calmly discussing my failing heart, confidently boasting to her attorney about the fake plan to split my assets doused in the middle. Dr. Preston raised his head sharply, his tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief, as he heard the woman he loved call him a spineless fool. The recording continued to play loudly, broadcasting Cynthia's vicious plan to secure the original handwritten prescription, pads, and encrypted text messages. Her recorded voice dripped with arrogant malice as she proudly detailed her strategy to hand the doctor straight over to the district attorney, fully intending to sue him for gross medical malpractice and frame him for first-degree manslaughter. A strangled sound escaped the doctor's throat. He stared at Cynthia as if she had suddenly transformed into a monster sitting right across from him. The recording moved seamlessly to her ultimate plan for my son. Derek's jaw dropped as he heard his stepmother boast about hiring a private forensic accountant to quietly track his hidden offshore shell companies. He listened to her triumphant laugh as she promised her attorney that the moment my body was in the ground, she would personally trigger a massive federal audit. Let him rot in a federal cell. Her recorded voice pierced through the hidden speakers, permanently destroying the fragile, deceitful alliance they had formed against me. The audio file ended with a sharp click, plunging the dining room back into a heavy silence. I walked slowly back to the head of the table, looking down at my paralyzed wife. She never intended to run away to the French Riviera with you, Miles, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. She planned to frame you for my passing, ensuring you spent the rest of your life in a maximum security federal prison, simply to keep you quiet. And as for you, Derek, I said, turning a piercing gaze to my hyperventilating son, she had the federal fraud department on speed dial. She was fully prepared to lock you away forever the day I was buried. She orchestrated this total destruction just to walk away with 100% of my estate. The shock hanging in the room quickly mutated into an explosive rage. Dr. Preston lunged forward, gripping the edge of the table with trembling hands. He screamed at Cynthia, his voice cracking in a hysterical breakdown as he cursed her for destroying his medical career and manipulating his feelings. Derek was crying uncontrollably, burying his face in his arms, rocking back and forth as the reality of his federal crimes finally took hold in his mind. Cynthia sat rigid, her face twisted into a mask of pure terror. She tried to stand, perhaps aiming to run toward the private elevator, but her trembling legs betrayed her, forcing her back into her chair. I watched the three of them tear each other apart, like desperate wolves trapped in a small, inescapable cage. The sophisticated facade of their lethal financial alliance had been shattered, leaving behind nothing but ugly betrayal in the ruins. They had arrogantly assumed they could easily outsmart a man who had spent 40 years conquering the most ruthless corporate raiders on the planet. They completely underestimated the cold rage of a patriarch, pushed past the limits of human forgiveness. Amid the hysterical shouting and pathetic sobbing, I remained completely calm. The crushing weight of justice was finally descending on them, and I intended to personally oversee every second of their complete financial and legal destruction. The heavy oak doors of the dining room burst open with a loud thud. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured into the space, shouting, commanding orders. The grand theatrical play of their miserable lives had reached its inevitable end. The federal agents moved with terrifying efficiency, flooding the grand dining room with weapons drawn. Their commanding voices ordered everyone to stay where they were. But the pure panic controlling my three treacherous guests shattered any possibility of order. Dr. Miles Preston ignored the officers completely. His medical career and personal freedom had just been destroyed by the woman sitting across from him, and that reality fractured his mind. Letting out a raw scream that tore through the chaos, he lunged forward across the mahogany table directly at Cynthia. His flailing arms swept across the white tablecloth, knocking over the wine decanter and his glass of Bordeaux. Dark red wine exploded across the table, splashing onto the porcelain and soaking the fabric like a pool of fresh blood. Ignoring the mess, Dr. Preston reached frantically for Cynthia's throat as he screamed a barrage of accusations, cursing her for manipulating his heart, luring him into a murder plot, and attempting to frame him for my passing. Cynthia screamed in terror, shoving her chair back to dodge his grabbing hands. The wooden chair overturned, sending her crashing heavily onto the cold marble floor. Before the doctor could reach her, two federal agents cut him off, tackling him to the ground and forcing his arms behind his back. The struggling cardiologist's screaming drowned out the soft string music I had left playing in the background. I remained motionless in my leather chair at the head of the table. Reaching out, I picked up my untouched glass of wine and took a satisfying sip. I watched the spectacle unfold before me with the detached gaze of a scientist studying an experiment. The grand stage I had set was operating precisely according to my design. Shifting my focus to my left I watched my son experience the total collapse of his existence. Derek didn't fight the agents. He lacked the courage for confrontation. Instead, as an officer grabbed his shoulder and ordered him to stand, Derek completely broke down. His knees gave out, and he collapsed pathetically onto the marble floor, weeping in a pile. His expensive tuxedo crumpled over his shaking shoulders. Hiding his face in his hands, he let out a series of hysterical sobs. Ignoring the agent, reading him his rights, he crawled pathetically on his hands and knees toward my chair. Reaching out a trembling hand, he grabbed the fabric of my trousers. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, with suffocating terror, his face smeared with tears as he gasped for air. He begged me to stop the federal agents. He implored me to use my vast wealth and corporate influence to make the nightmare disappear. He desperately promised to do whatever I wanted, vowing to work in an entry-level position at the logistics empire for the rest of his life. He screamed that if I didn't step in and help pay his debts, his underground creditors would kill him in federal prison. I looked down at the pathetic creature clutching my leg. I felt no paternal warmth, no instinct to protect the boy I had raised. All I saw was a greedy parasite who had actively planned to watch me suffocate on synthetic poison. Very gently but firmly, I pressed the sole of my leather shoe against his chest, pushing him back and breaking his desperate grip on my trousers. In a calm, ruthless voice, I told him that the moment he decided my life was worth less than his gambling debts, he had forged his own federal chains. 2 federal agents stepped forward, grabbing Derek's arms and dragging his limp body off the marble floor. They quickly locked heavy steel handcuffs around his trembling wrists. Across the dining room, Cynthia struggled to her feet. The mask of the perfect hostess had melted away, leaving the desperate face of a trapped sociopath. Her emerald gown was torn at the hem and stained with red wine. Ignoring the agents attempting to read her rights, she turned a wild gaze directly at me, her face twisted in pure hatred. She unleashed a torrent of venomous curses that echoed off the high penthouse ceiling, calling me a vindictive, paranoid old man. She screamed that I had treated her like a corporate accessory for 20 years and that I deserved everything. Her screams quickly shifted from angry insults to desperate legal bargaining. Turning her focus frantically to the lead agent, she claimed absolute legal immunity, screaming that she was actually working as a corporate whistleblower. She lied that she had secretly gathered evidence against Derek and Dr. Preston with the noble intention of handing it to the authorities, insisting she was innocent of any conspiracy and was merely acting to gather necessary evidence. The lead federal agent, a tall man with a stern expression, stared at her with unvarnished disgust. He calmly informed her that they had been reviewing the audio recordings intercepted from her walk-in closet all morning. He pointed out that her detailed private conversation with her attorney completely destroyed any claim of being an innocent whistleblower. Recalling her own words from the recording, he reminded her that she had explicitly planned to wait for my heart to stop before framing the doctor and destroying my son. The realization that her own clever trap had been turned against her brought her screaming to a sudden halt. Cynthia stood frozen in the middle of the ruined room, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. Heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around her slender wrists, locking her permanently into the harsh reality brought on by her own greed. I sat comfortably at the head of the table, slowly swirling the dark vintage wine in my crystal glass. The rich aroma of expensive Bordeaux blended perfectly with the deeply satisfying scent of absolute justice. I took another slow, deliberate sip, letting the smooth flavor cover my tongue. Leaning back in my heavy chair, I calmly watched the federal agents drag the three broken monsters out of my penthouse, permanently purging their toxic shadows from my life. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open once more, with a loud thud. Led by my chief attorney, Mitchell Crawford, the district attorney stepped into the room. Adjusting his suit jacket, Mitchell offered me a nod of deep respect. The chaos of the federal raid swept across the polished marble floor. The tactical officer's authoritative shouts echoed loudly, instantly shattering any remaining tension. The trap I had engineered had closed tight around them. Now, I sat quietly at the head of the mahogany table, swirling my wine. Dr. Miles Preston raised his trembling hands into the air, all color drained from his arrogant face. He stumbled backward away from the agents, stammering a series of frantic denials. He claimed he was merely a dutiful medical professional attending a private anniversary dinner, ignoring his pathetic lies. A stern officer grabbed the collar of his velvet jacket and slammed him face down onto the polished table. Heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut, sealing his criminal fate. The district attorney stepped forward, a thick stack of arrest warrants held tightly in his hand. He looked down at the sobbing cardiologist with pure professional disgust, informing Dr. Preston that he was being officially charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, along with numerous severe violations of medical ethics. The doctor whimpered like a wounded animal, begging for leniency he didn't deserve. He foolishly tried to shift the blame for the entire plot onto Cynthia, screaming hysterically that she had manipulated his feelings and forced him into it. The agent simply pulled him up by his lapels, ignoring his tearful cries for mercy. On the other side of the room, Cynthia was backed into the far corner. Her stunning emerald gown was now a crumpled, ruined rag, and her blonde hair hung messily over her panicked face. Two female federal agents closed in on her. Cynthia raised her hands defensively, shaking her head in disbelief. She screamed aggressively that this was a massive mistake, claiming she was the wife of a wealthy man and that they had no legal right to touch her. Ignoring her shouts, the officers quickly brought her hands behind her back, subduing her immediately. The cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around Cynthia's wrists, echoing sharply through the penthouse. She let out a sharp scream, her body thrashing against the firm grip of the trained officers. Mitchell Crawford stepped forward, holding a fresh legal document right in front of her tear-filled eyes. He calmly informed her that she was facing federal charges for attempted murder, major wire fraud, and grand conspiracy. Cynthia spat a curse directly at his face. Her flawless facade had been replaced by the brutal desperation of a cornered predator. Turning her tear-stained face toward the head of the table, she locked her blue eyes on my calm expression. She demanded that I stop this madness immediately, desperately insisting that despite her mistakes, I still loved her deep down. Setting my crystal glass onto the mahogany surface, I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I looked straight into her panicked eyes, telling her that the only thing I felt for her now was deep, unadulterated pity. I explained clearly that her extreme greed had permanently blinded her to the absolute reality of her impending ruin. The district attorney gestured to the two officers, instructing them to remove the struggling prisoner from the property. Cynthia kicked and screamed hysterically as the agents dragged her, her custom dress trailing across the marble floor. Her loud screams faded rapidly as the agents forced her into the waiting private elevator in the foyer. Dr. Miles Preston was the next betrayer physically removed from my home. The arrogant cardiologist had completely broken down, crying uncontrollably as two tall officers roughly escorted him past my chair. He lacked the strength to even look at me. His entire world, built on medical arrogance and deceit, had been dismantled in less than 20 minutes. The heavy elevator doors closed smoothly with a chime, taking the weeping doctor down to the police cruisers waiting outside Chicago's towering skyscrapers. It was completely over. Mitchell Crawford walked calmly to the head of the table, pulled out a leather chair, and sat directly beside me. Placing his leather briefcase on the mahogany surface, he offered a satisfied smile, noting softly that the federal operation had been executed flawlessly. The district attorney stood nearby, observing the ruins scattered across the penthouse. He offered a polite nod, acknowledging the confidential cooperation I had provided to his criminal division over the past 3 agonizing months. Together, we had built an airtight legal case against the 2 co-conspirators, trapping them in their own criminal hubris. I took another smooth, satisfying sip of vintage Bordeaux, letting the dark liquid wash away the lingering taste of betrayal. Looking at Mitchell, I thanked him firmly for his unwavering loyalty during this difficult period. He bowed his head respectfully, stating that bringing down such parasites was the highlight of his career. I turned a calm gaze back to the quiet dining room. Outside, the rainstorm continued to batter the large glass windows, masking the sound of police sirens echoing through the dark Chicago streets below. The suffocating tension that had poisoned the air was completely gone, replaced by a deep sense of satisfaction. I had protected the logistics empire I built over 40 years. I had outsmarted an arrogant cardiologist and a sociopathic wife who foolishly thought they could conquer me. The frail, dying old man they had eagerly planned to bury had been nothing more than a giant illusion. Standing up from the leather chair, I felt stronger and more vital than I had in 20 years. Walking slowly to the wide glass windows, I looked down at the illuminated city shining through the rain. My carefully planned trap had concluded flawlessly. The empire was finally safe. Just as the federal agents were roughly dragging my screaming wife and weeping doctor toward the heavy oak doors, I raised my right hand in a decisive gesture. The lead agent paused, looking back at me with a questioning glance. I pointed my finger directly at my son, who was curled into a trembling ball on the polished marble floor. I instructed the authorities that they could take Dr. Preston and Cynthia away immediately, but they had to leave the boy with me. The lead agent gave a silent nod, understanding the complex parameters of the immunity deal my legal team had negotiated earlier that day. An agent stepped forward, grabbed Derek's shaking shoulder, and unclasped the heavy steel handcuffs with a loud metallic click. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off Cynthia's desperate screams and plunging the ruined dining room into a thick silence. Only Derek remained. He stayed on his hands and knees, staring blankly at the dark red wine pooling on the marble floor. He was hyperventilating, his thin chest heaving with rapid breaths, slowly raising his head. A faint glimmer of pathetic hope flickered in his bloodshot eyes. He genuinely believed that because the agents had removed his handcuffs, his father had decided to spare him, forgive his betrayal, and fix his catastrophic mistakes. "Get up!" I ordered, my voice devoid of any paternal warmth. It was a cold, detached tone, the exact voice I used when liquidating a failed corporate subsidiary. Derek struggled to comply. His legs shook so violently he had to grab the edge of the mahogany table to pull himself up. Standing before me, his expensive tuxedo was crumpled and stained. His face a picture of pure cowardice. He opened his mouth to offer another weeping apology, but I cut him off immediately. You are officially relieved of your duties as Chief Operating Officer of the Logistics Empire. Effective immediately, I stated, my words falling like heavy stones. Your corporate security clearances have been revoked. Your digital access to the main servers, offshore accounts, and international ledgers has been permanently severed. You no longer hold any authority, any title, or any association with the company I built. Derek swayed on his feet, his jaw dropping. Dad, please, he whimpered, tears sliding down his pale face. You can't just cut me off. The crypto debt is massive. Those people don't care about excuses. If I don't transfer the funds by midnight, they'll kill me. That is no longer my problem, Derek, I replied calmly, leaning back in my leather chair with my hands resting on the armrests. I spent the afternoon working directly with my forensic accountants and private banking team. We completely drained the 12 fake shell companies you established. We successfully recovered every single dollar of the $4 million you embezzled. But we didn't stop there. I watched his eyes widen in terror as the reality of my Counterstrike began to sink into his mind. I also legally attached every single one of your personal financial assets, I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet room. I liquidated your private investment portfolio and emptied your checking and savings accounts. I even instructed my legal team to lock up the equity in your downtown penthouse to cover the legal fees and internal audit costs generated by your massive corporate fraud. You took everything, Derek gasped, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. You left me with nothing. Dad, you're signing my death warrant. Those loan sharks are ruthless. They'll find me and tear me apart. I didn't send you to federal prison, Derek. I leaned forward, locking a cold gaze onto his tearful face. Prison would provide 3 hot meals a day and a secure cell. For a son who sat comfortably in my living room, discussing how long synthetic poison would take to stop his father's heart, prison is a mercy you do not deserve. Derek fell to his knees, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor, weeping uncontrollably. He begged for my forgiveness, imploring for one final financial lifeline, swearing he would disappear and never bother me again. I felt nothing for him. The deep grief I had experienced when I first heard his betrayal on the recording had evaporated, completely replaced by the hard clarity of justice. You are going to walk out that door right now with nothing, I announced, my voice carrying an undeniable finality. You have no job, no trust fund, no family legacy, and no protection. You have been stripped of the powerful name you disgraced, and you should know, Derek, that your violent underground creditors are currently waiting for you downstairs in the lobby. My security team politely informed them that you would be leaving the building shortly. Derek let out a raw scream, born of pure terror. He scrambled backward across the marble floor, desperate to avoid the heavy oak doors leading out of the penthouse. But his resistance was entirely futile. I raised my hand, signaling the private security guards standing in the shadows of the foyer. 2 tall men in crisp black suits stepped forward, their expressions cold and unreadable. Grabbing my struggling son by the arms, they lifted him off the floor effortlessly. Derek kicked and screamed, shouting my name, begging me to save him from the fate waiting in the lobby below. I ignored his desperate pleas completely. Sitting quietly at the head of the ruined mahogany table, I swirled the dark vintage Bordeaux in my crystal glass watching the heavy doors close tightly behind him, sealing him out of my world forever. The penthouse was finally shrouded in a deep, absolute silence. The suffocating presence of my treacherous wife, the arrogant cardiologist, and my cowardly son had been completely cleared away. Outside the heavy glass windows, the storm still raged, rain battering the thick panes. But inside the dining room, the heavy atmosphere had lifted. The stage was empty. The lethal drama had drawn to a close. I slowly raised my crystal glass to the empty room, quietly toasting to my survival and the peaceful future ahead. When the dust finally settled, a profound quiet returned to my home. The ornate mahogany table, once set for a treacherous celebration, stood completely bare, holding only faint traces of spilled wine and broken crystal. I walked slowly through the spacious living area, savoring the crisp, quiet air that had so recently been thick with lies and malicious ambition. Stepping through the glass doors onto the wide balcony, I found that the storm had cleared, leaving behind a cold, clear night sky. Standing by the smooth metal railing, I looked out over the flickering Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly into the dark distance, a beautiful tribute to resilience and enduring strength. I stood there for hours, breathing in the cold air, watching car lights navigate the sprawling grid below. Taking a deep breath, I let the crisp night air fill my lungs. I was alone. I had no family left. The woman I married was sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, stripped of her designer gowns and her sociopathic dreams of endless wealth. The son I had raised was wandering the city streets, desperately looking over his shoulder, permanently exiled from the fortress of my empire. The cardiologist who violated his sacred oath was facing the total destruction of his career and freedom. I had ruthlessly severed every blood bond and marriage vow, about to kick out into the rain, casting them into the wilderness they so thoroughly deserved. Yet, as I stood there, watching the shining city, I felt no regret. I had my health, my corporate empire, and my absolute freedom. The very next morning, I returned to my executive office with renewed, relentless focus. I systematically restructured the entire board of directors at my logistics company, promoting loyal, brilliant individuals who had earned their positions through decades of hard work. I rooted out the toxic culture I had tried to foster, replacing it with a system of absolute transparency and strict accountability. My business flourished, growing stronger and far more profitable than it had been in 20 years. The chaotic mess my son had secretly created was smoothly erased, replaced by an efficient network operating with absolute precision. Every morning, I felt a surge of energy flowing through my veins. But I knew that securing my financial legacy wasn't enough. I thought deeply about the failing heart that had initially made me vulnerable to their calculations. I decided to use my vast wealth to create something of profound significance. Legally establishing a heavily funded medical trust, I dedicated it entirely to funding advanced cardiovascular research and providing free, life-saving heart surgeries for underprivileged patients. I channeled millions to brilliant, dedicated physicians who respected human life, ensuring that men, women, and children could receive the medical miracles they desperately needed. The penthouse is quiet now, but it is a deeply comforting, peaceful silence. I no longer walk with a wooden cane, nor do I sleep with one eye open, waiting for wolves in the dark. I survived the worst betrayal imaginable, burning down my own house to cleanse the ground beneath it. This empire stands taller and more impenetrable than ever, led firmly by a man who has learned to see the world clearly for what it is. I am completely unstoppable, untouchable, and entirely free from their poison. The lesson is clear. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a polite smile can hide the sharpest blade. In life, we often turn a blind eye to danger signals from those closest to us because the truth is too painful to accept. But ignoring reality will not protect you. It only empowers those who wish to exploit you. True strength lies in having the courage to see people for who they actually are, rather than who you wish they were. And when betrayal comes from inside your own home, you must be willing to burn the house down to survive the flames.